I am going to give you guys a little bit of introduction on some of my journey into the world of open source, both from an educational standpoint and a production standpoint. Um, so a little bit of background on me. I've been an artist in the early days. Did some high school advanced programs. Went into fine art and graphic design. Worked up through. Got a degree in computer animation. Another one in game design when I got interested in programming, and then an MFA at Clemson that sort of combines all those things. Semi recently, I did begin into a PhD, but stepped away from it because, as you'll see at the end of the presentation, I decided it was time to have a family. What am I looking at moving forward? Well, specifically when it comes to open source and whatnot, trying to push a little bit of that while also sort of balancing my use and understanding and use in education for closed source software as well. Specifically, my background, closed source software, of course, is your Adobe products, your Autodesk products, things of that nature. So a little bit of splash of some of the things that I have worked on educationally, from early days of fine art through computer animation, through programming and simulation. Most of my production experience has been here in the Southeast. So I did do early days in illustration and graphic design. Moved into some visualization with 3D and indie game development several years ago, and most recently I have been doing some of my own indie game development, but also a lot of paid contract work via things like VR training simulations, and I plan to sort of move forward with that in the future. So a couple images, sort of splashing that up there. Some VR training down the bottom left. Some indie game development on the bottom left. VR training in the bottom right, and then I have done some 3D modeling for miniatures as well for tabletop gaming. Educationally wise, I've been teaching throughout all these different phases of my life. Even way back, starting at the YMCA, running summer camps and whatnot. In the 2000s, moved into game design and game development teaching. So did some stuff at ITT. I've worked off and on for several years at Western Piedmont Community College in North Carolina, Blue Ridge Community College in North Carolina, and a little bit at Clemson. And then beyond this slide, just recently I transitioned into the role of instructor for animation at the South Carolina Governor's School of the Arts and Humanities. So what I'd like to do is sort of lay these things out or sort of address these concepts of open source software in both the educational and the production side of things. I do think it's good to sort of couch some of these ideas in hey, what does it look like if you're more of an indie versus a professional, or I shouldn't say professional, a AAA level developer. There are some different considerations and different ways to look at some of these things. But as you'll see, we're going to highlight Blender a lot in this talk. And, there are different studios out there that are using Blender that are larger. So Ubisoft, Montreal, more of their cinematic side of things is using Blender fairly heavily. So it's starting to sort of permeate on that side of things as well. But you will see that there's been a longer history in smaller projects that have taken advantage of some of this open source. So we're talking about open source in production. Again, from an indie or a smaller studio standpoint, the biggest thing that you probably will gain from some of this is, or using some of these tools, is of course the cost, right? Because open source being free or very, very cheap, depending on how you're approaching it, you're going to save on software. That's always great. The trade-off, can be, what does that look like in terms of productivity? Can the team transition over to open source software? Does the software support your feature set that you're trying to utilize in your projects? So hopefully we'll address some of those things throughout this talk. And then on the educational side, I think the big thing with open source that I find interesting is that depending on what sort of student demographics you're trying to support, sometimes the accessibility, and especially beyond the degree program, I've found that the accessibility to the tools can facilitate some further development. Whereas closed source, while it is still accessible, but let's be honest. I mean, I'm right now I'm rocking the full sort of suite of Autodesk and Adobe stuff and whatnot, and Unity and other things, as well as all my open source tools. And I'm kind of bouncing between those things in both some of the stuff I'm required to teach and some of the projects that I'm working on. If we're talking on the cheapest end for an individual, you're probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,500, $2,000 worth of software that you have to keep up with per year. So from an educational standpoint, and people getting out of a degree program, especially if it's a 2-year degree program, and getting into work probably through contract work or other things like that, being able to maintain that software is a bit of a challenge sometimes. So depending on who you're working with, student wise, the open source might be the benefit you need to get students to keep working. Personally, that's one of the biggest things that I have found in terms of success in students isn't necessarily just how hard they work during a degree program, but also how do they follow through after the degree program. And so many of us, and life happens. I'm proof of that myself. And it's harder and harder to sort of maintain that level of work after school if you don't immediately land that job, or you're having to do contract work and whatnot. So not having the burden of paying thousands of dollars a year in software can be a benefit. Anywho, let's sort of talk about production, and I'll get to the end of this, and then I'll open it up for questions, or however, Andrew, you guys are handling the questions this time around virtually. You can jump in in the middle. It's perfectly fine, but I'm just going to keep going pretty quickly. So if you need to stop me, just let me know. So what are we trying to do or accomplish in production? Well, usually we have a phase of things, right? We have ideation, we have pre-production, we have production itself. The evaluation and iteration phases where we sort of go back through and rework things, and then usually some level of post-production where we sort of clean up and evaluate the results of our production. So what are our considerations when it comes to the software oftentimes? Well, performance, right? So does the software perform well? I can tell you from a general standpoint that one of the things that I've found working with open source software is that oftentimes it's a little, or can be, depending on the operation, a little bit more memory hungry. And the scalability sometimes in terms of how it scales, how certain softwares and certain operations scale in terms of core count, right? So you might not be able to throw the top of the line Threadripper at it and get a linear performance scaling. So there's sort of a balance to be had there depending on what you're trying to do. The features and efficacy of those features, like how effective are they at doing the things that you need them to do? The ecosystem and integration. So one of the benefits, one of the things that Adobe really does dominate with is the ecosystem that it provides, and the interoperability between the softwares. And so open source generally doesn't have some of this when it crosses beyond the bounds of one piece of software, except for some particular circumstances. Stability, how stable it is. Does the software do what you need to do and not crash all the time? So support, roadmap, how long the software is going to be supported. I think that one of the reasons that there is sort of this growth in the use of open source software is in part because Blender has had a track record and continues to develop and show their hands as far as like where they're going with the software. and that they are listening to the community, and that they're going to grow in the direction that is needed. I think that is a huge deal, because you don't want to invest a lot of time and energy into a piece of software only for it to evaporate. And we'll talk about some of the softwares that I'm going to demonstrate today, at least in really quick demonstrations, and how I kind of feel about my sort of spidey sense as far as how they're performing in terms of support and long-term roadmap and development. Resources, like what sort of learning and so when you have to convert people over, say, from Maya, what are the learning resources to onboard people into the software? What's the community like? Licensing. I mean, open source is free, but there are certain instances, like we'll look at ArmorPaint today, and ArmorPaint is free if you compile it yourself, but the developer that creates ArmorPaint does have it for sale if you want a pre-compiled version. And so, how that sort of plays out might matter to you. I know years ago at Siege, there was a legal panel, and I brought up the question to the lawyer about if something's made in open source software, does that make the output open source? And it was a very PC answer to that, but I think there are a lot of concerns with how open source software, how freemium or versus premium or software, how that relates license wise. But generally there's no precedence that I'm aware of as far as legally, so I don't think you have anything to worry about that, but it is sort of a grayish area. And then I think the big one is usability, right? Like how easily can you get in and just use the software? For me personally, I have a lot of I have some background in UX. I have some knowledge on that side of things, and there's even paid for software like ZBrush, which I think have personally, my opinion is they have really bad UI and UX design. Not to say that open source is perfect in any sort of way, but that's another level or degree that we need to evaluate the software on it in the context of our pipeline. So, easiest place to start with some of this stuff is definitely with your operating systems. Now, depending on what you're trying to do, there are some benefits with saying just going completely open source with your operating system. Me personally, you can probably see I'm running Windows 11. I personally think Windows 11 is fairly solid, but I'm sort of locked into it a little bit more because of some of the choices I'm making in development. If I were to look at, say, a Linux distribution, my sort of bent at this moment is probably leaning towards Manjaro. But what is the benefit of some of that? Well, if you go look at some of the benchmarking for Blender, and specifically some of the rendering, which when you talk about baking your textures and all that stuff, it runs using a lot of the same code that is for the rendering for images and whatnot. You do see a performance difference there between Windows and Linux most of the time. That sort of, we could talk about hardware as well. If I'm just sort of spitballing here, I do think you're generally middle of the road hardware. So prosumer hardware works really well in the open source ecosystem, and it does tend to skew more towards using NVIDIA GPUs rather than AMD GPUs, but really, quite honestly, again, it comes down to like what you're trying to achieve. Collaboration tools. Okay, I'm going to skip this one or sort of breeze over this one because it's fairly straightforward here. There's not a lot of good stuff out there that is completely open source and free. There are some projects that are trying to be similar to some of the Google services, but the hosting of the files and whatnot, it comes at a monthly subscription cost. Of course, you have Git. Unity had Collaborate and now is using Plastics SCM. So in terms of source control, there's some options out there, but I would say this is one of the areas where I would just double down, and at least for collaboration and documentation, I generally just go with the Google Docs as my primary, just because it checks a lot of check boxes. It has that interoperability, right? So you have that ecosystem there. The cloud usage is very helpful a lot of times, but there are pros and cons to even that. I would say, true too. It sort of depends on how big of your project's going to scale. A smaller project's a lot easier to manage through Google Docs than something that's it has 300-400 people working on it. All right, so when we talk about collaboration, Blender actually itself has started to move towards integrating some collaboration. Now, Blender tends to skew a little bit towards the film production side of things in terms of where some of its efforts have gone in this side of development. And so if we look at, well, I had it pulled up before, but basically if you go to Blender Studio, that's where they have a lot of their tools for film project management. However, Blender itself does have an internal asset library. So if you go over here, this version of Blender, if let me duplicate my layout tab here and use this one to sort of show this off. If I switch over to the asset browser, this is a way to have an internal storage of assets, and these things could be they're similar. You can think of them similar to Unity's prefab system. So you can bundle things together, and you can take models, put materials on them, put textures on them, have animation files, and then store them into a library. And so I don't have anything populated in my system right here, but I haven't tried this yet. But in a group project, in a production setting, you probably could use this with a network drive and just have the assets available to artists to get through this asset browser through the network drive. So if I switch over here to user library here, you can set up a bunch of different directories that different types of assets can link to. So again, I haven't had a use case yet to put this out on a network drive, but it seems like you could sort of do that stuff. It seems like Blender internally is using that as well. One of the big things with their most recent Sprite Flight movie was that it actually had they've introduced a pose library for animators, and so they use the asset browser to store all the poses, and then they would just sort of insert the different poses and then clean up the animation afterwards. So if you haven't seen Sprite Flight, it's a really high quality CG film that I would say, look at it for the quality, but also it had a huge tie-in with the development of this asset browser functionality. So ideation and planning, this is just documentation, right? So obviously, if you're trying to save on money and other things like that, you can just do traditional sort of pen and paper. But flowcharts, spreadsheets, other things like that. Again, I would lean very heavily on Google Docs personally. Right now, I don't have a great solution for open source that is also cloud-based and free. There are some out there, like I said, but they do charge for a subscription fee. So when we talk about design, right? So when we're going into the spreadsheets for things like project management, doing your Gantt charts, holding on to your asset list, things of that nature, same sort of stuff. Now, if you're working locally, of course, you can use things like OpenOffice or LibreOffice as alternatives. But again, most of the time, definitely after having the change that went on during the pandemic, we are working remotely, so having that cloud-based setup is pretty much essential these days. All right, so let's get to the meat and potatoes of content creation. So if we're talking about starting off things, usually starts with concept art. Options out there, of course, GIMP. Krita is one that I prefer. Inkscape is good for vector. And then, of course, Blender can actually do this 2.5D thing called grease pencil. So let me show you a couple of those things. So first of all, GIMP generally, I mean, GIMP's fairly, straightforward in terms of being a Photoshop-like clone. I would say if I'm looking at GIMP as a tool in the tool set, it's mainly to do image manipulation, something like maybe trying to like delight textures to get a clean albedo texture out of a photograph. Things that are photo oriented, but most of the time we're not doing too much of this as much anymore because we don't hand texture using photo reference in the same sort of way. If we're doing anything, we're probably converting photos into a PBR material, right, and using that. So GIMP is great, but when we are doing sort of 2D stuff, if it's concept art, having a program like Krita is really good for painting. So, obviously you can, paint and draw in here all day long, just like you would with things like Photoshop, but it does try and simulate brushes as well, right? I also think it's really good for sprite animation. So let me switch to my animation workspace here. So it does handle the basics of animation. That's a really, really simple animation, but it does handle the basics of animation. So you can do hand-drawn keyframe animation. So if you're doing a 2D game, this could be very useful for that. Finally, in terms of texturing and hand painting texturing, it has some nice tools. Obviously, you can mirror your input here, but tileability. So you can create a tileable texture pretty easily here. It's lagging a little bit, I think, because everything I have open here. But you get the idea. You can create a tileable texture fairly easily using some of the tileability functionality in Krita. And again, it has all those sort of painterly brushes similar to what you would see in a lot of the Photoshop stuff, but definitely like Procreate and other things of that nature. So I think Krita is a really great option. The bonus is, and I'll sort of bring this up occasionally because I've sort of tried to dabble a little bit into how some of these tools are available in tablet form. So Krita does come in an Android format, so you can use it. Android does not come in iOS for different reasons. You can go on their website and see what their reasoning why they haven't gotten to put it on an iPad yet. But some of these softwares are available in a tablet form, and thus on the go type of work is acceptable. Finally, Grease Pencil. Let's take a look at that really quickly. So Grease Pencil it looks like a 2D drawing tool, and it does support animation. But let's just say I draw it here. It's actually 2.5D. So the thing is you're doing concept art in Grease Pencil. You could, let me go back to the front here and just sort of illustrate this way. You could say draw orthographic on one side, rotate camera, draw orthographic on another side, and then draw in 3D space here. I didn't quite connect those things, but let's say I'm making like a concept for a car, right? I can work in 3D space to create those things. I can also animate using Grease Pencil. So it's sort of a weird combination of 2.5D plus your traditional sort of hand-drawn animation, but these things are actually curves. And so you can do a lot of stuff with interpolated animation by deforming the curves and whatnot. So Grease Pencil is kind of an interesting and powerful tool. And I would say you could also, if you're trying to do animatics, it's really nice because that 2.5D, you can bring in 3D objects. You could block out like a scene for an animatic and then draw in that space and work back and forth very fluidly. So GIMP for raster, Krita for raster and animation, Inkscape for vector stuff, and I'll say it's fairly recently, about 6 months ago, they had a major update that actually they addressed some of the performance issues with that, and so it's back up and running really, really well. And then Grease Pencil again for 2D concept, but also you can do sort of 2.5D stuff for more of a 3D concept workflow or a animatic workflow. I'll have it in the slides here. I'm not going to play this for time's sake, but Brad Coble, I believe is his name, on YouTube, did a nice comparison between Adobe and Affinity, sort of looking item for item. I don't think he's done an open source comparison, for 2D digital work. But Affinity is if you haven't checked out Affinity, if you want sort of like a prosumer alternative to a lot of the Adobe stuff for Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, that kind of thing, they're a nice fit. And the big thing that I think Affinity is leading the way with is that their applications are almost the exact same on the iPad. So if you want to work with it on the iPad, well, I guess the other big thing too is it's a one-time, like you pay for it once and you own it forever, versus a subscription model. So Affinity is an interesting alternative if you want to see something that's a little bit more refined than some of the open source options and tries to be a real competitor with the Adobe stuff on a one-to-one basis. But it isn't open source and it isn't free. It is cheap. I believe the iPad versions are only like $20 a piece. So when we talk about 3D modeling, right? Your traditional sort of stuff like moving vertices, edges, faces around. Also, when we're looking at that, there's a lot of competitors. One, if you're interested in an interesting retopology software on an iPad, there is a one called Cozy Blanket that just came out. That's really neat. But when you're talking about professional stuff, you're talking about Autodesk Maya, 3D Studio Max. Open source, really, Blender dominates this space when it comes to 3D modeling. I would say if you're familiar with 3D Studio Max, you might have an easier time coming over to Blender. I'm not traditionally a big Max user, but just from what I can tell, it seems like Blender borrows, but has some similar design concepts behind it that might be easier. However, I'll go ahead and say if you are coming from Maya, let's go to this one right here. One thing you can do if you want to leapfrog having to learn some of the controls is you can just go to the edit preferences and you can switch your key mapping to industry compatible. It does lose some of the things that would be would have shortcut keys, do not have shortcut keys in the industry compatible, but it does act and behave a lot more like Maya in terms of interface once you do that. So if you're new to it, that might be a good way to make the leap across or begin to make the leap across. But then, beyond sort of like manually modeling things, you have procedural, right? So you have stuff like Houdini, and this could be really good for like level design or trying to create maybe like a pipe or something like that where you want to repeat a item down the pipe but maintain the curvature. Houdini sort of been the go-to. Blender here recently in the past year or so has opened up into what's called geometry nodes. And geometry nodes are again a node-based sort of setup where similar to what you would get in the nodes in Maya or Houdini, but trying to really emulate a lot of the same functionality like Houdini has. And so again, in the last 6 months or year, these geometry nodes have come a long way. Now this sort of begins the transition to everything nodes. So Blender is trying to transition the entire software over to a node-based setup. And so the idea would be everything would be driven by node networks, and you could go in there and edit all these node networks, create your own, and create unique functionality out of that. So there are a couple tutorials out there if you want to check them out on YouTube on how to do like procedural building construction, where you just sort of give it the modular pieces and then plump in some parameters, and boom, you have building A, building B, so on and so forth. Sculpting, Blender has had a little bit longer, but it's had a real big push into the sculpting realm. And while it's not ZBrush in terms of pushing the ridiculous amount of polygons, if you have decent enough hardware, you can pretty much sculpt in Blender and get a pretty detailed sculpt. And using the same sort of tools, the benefits that I've experienced, and let me go ahead and just a new scene here. The benefits I've experienced then, and I've heard from other artists, is that when you're sculpting in here, ZBrush is not technically 3D, right? So when you're sculpting in Blender, you're essentially working in 3D, or you have a more accurate 3D perspective viewport. And so a lot of the sculpting is a little bit more straightforward. But you have all your major brushes over here. It's for the most part, there's some couple of things I would say that are kind of niche that are missing, but most of the stuff you need is over here. Big ones like your clay strips, to layer in volume. You also have some unique ones. And again, this isn't going to be a full-on sculpting thing, but it has cloth brushes to sort of simulate cloth using the internal physics system. Okay, so there's a lot to be said with where Blender has sort of grown in the sculpting side of things. Now, they just recently introduced where is it? Vertex painting in sculpting here. Now, again, you can't push quite as high polygons, but I've worked with 5 million polygons on a I'm running a 3090 XT CPU. Right now I have 32 gigs of RAM, but I had 64 before, but I've never really maxed out even the 32, and I'm running a Radeon 7 graphics card in my machine. So all modest prosumer type hardware that's got a couple years on it, kind of thing. But I've never run into with sculpting at least a need to push my memory beyond the bounds of what is normal. So I think you can get some pretty good results with Blender. It has some unique tools. The texture painting or the vertex painting is new-ish, but it's receiving constant updates. Modeling, retopology, right? So after you've sculpted stuff, you got to clean it up and make it usable for game or in-game assets. I will say this is an area where Blender falls down. Okay, there are ways to retopologize in Blender, but Maya's way of handling it with modeling tools and stuff like that is much more fluid. Like Blender has similar tools, but the overall experience is a little bit more clunky, and you have to sort of set things up. It's not as easy as saying, "Hey, make that model my target," and I just start pulling out faces across it. So the retopo stuff in Blender is a bit clunky. You can do it. You can do great stuff with it because, again, most of the time, what makes great art isn't the tool; it's the artist. And so you can do it, but in certain circumstances, it's a little bit clunky. And what I would suggest is, if you find it to be too clunky, one of the big benefits, since Blender is running Python, is people make tools for Blender all the time. So this is going to be a pro and a con. So there are tools out there like Speed Retopo seems to be a really good one. I haven't personally downloaded this and tried this yet. One of the ones that's sort of a community favorite for several years now, it's on its third version, is Retopo Flow. But you can see, $86 for a personal license. So you're already sort of spending a decent chunk of change just to fix a problem that, again, isn't quite broken with Blender, but it isn't ideal. And so the general consensus usually is Blender, is very transparent with the roadmap. A lot of these things I'm going to put out there as negatives, Blender has acknowledged and is working on solutions for these things. So retopology is on their radar. Of course, you have 3D scanning, photogrammetry, right? About the only solution out there that I feel is worth looking into. Personally, my prosumer paid-for software is Agisoft Metashape. I've used a little bit of reality capture and 3D Zephyr, but like I said, I ran an AMD card, and so those softwares generally lean more towards NVIDIA cards. The only one that's open source that's out there that's decent is Meshroom. And Meshroom has a couple benefits. First of all, it's a node-based setup, so if you want to create more operations, you just add more nodes to the processing pipeline inside of Meshroom. So you can do some pretty unique stuff because of that. Downside is it's about half to 3/4 of the speed of processing versus the other softwares. So, and then, again, looking at some of those items in terms of what we are concerned with. So performance is a little bit low. Features and efficacy, I think features-wise, it's pretty good. I mean, unless you're doing very specialized stuff, like very large-scale scans of like like in some of the photogrammetry communities that I'm in, they do large scale scans of like ships, and so they're scanning all the interior spaces of the ship and whatnot. Something like Meshroom, I don't think would be ideal for that. Stability, I haven't had it crash too much on me. Support, it seems like development on this is fairly slow. So if you go to their page, and make sure if you do go check them out, make sure you go to the right one. You want to go to the alicevision.org one. If you Google Meshroom, you'll get a bunch of weird stuff. Don't just download the stuff that is out there. But if you go to alicevision.org, Meshroom software, you'll find this. I think it's decent. I would feel more confident in it if they would make the updates a little bit more frequently. I don't know the team specifically, but they do seem to be, sharp. They just don't seem to be like cranking on the software where you get an update every, more than every 6 months. And again, you have to use an NVIDIA card for that. UVing. So Blender has serviceable UVing tools. They're not great. They are sort of lacking in some ways, but they get the job done. And to be honest, even in Maya, most of the extra UV tools that are there, I don't use anyway because I learned 3D when it was like super basic, and so most of my workflow personally is using very simple tools, and I can get things knocked out very quickly. So the tools in Blender their sort of limited options don't bother me as much. But if you do want to push the bounds of texturing, there are several tools that are paid for, but one that is free is Text Tools, and it's a plugin for Blender, and it provides a lot of different stuff in terms of manipulating UVs. Okay. I would say a lot of these things are great, but I don't use a ton of them even when I use Text Tools. The big boon for me is the texture baking for Text Tools, and we'll talk about that more here in a second. So, when we're talking about, again, I already talked about this, about 2D texturing, right? You can use your GIMP or your Kritas instead of your Photoshops or whatnot. But when we talk about most common workflows today, we're looking at 3D painting on surfaces using PBR text or PBR materials to paint directly on the surface, and that pretty much falls in the dominant area of Adobe Substance tools. Of course, you do have Quixel Mixer and 3D Coat out there to work with if you want to pay for those. Blender does have some 3D texturing functionality. So if I go back over here, new, and let's just say add, okay, material, cool. Give me 1 second as I add in my image texture, new. I'm doing this in the most sloppy sort of way, but if I set this up to have a texture to paint on, it does have some basic texture painting that you can paint in 2D and 3D and see it, back and forth. Okay, but it doesn't have layers. It doesn't have. You're not painting with materials. You're just painting the RGB value of the brush. So it is a bit limited. However, you do have ArmorPaint. And ArmorPaint is been out for a while. They basically took the project that used to be Blender Game Engine or BGE and said, hey, we want to still make a game engine that's using Blender's core libraries as its foundation. And then this group decided, oh, well, we can spin this off into a texture painting thing. And then they also just spun it off into a AI-driven texture creation tool. So it's fairly powerful. So this is like a creature that I'm working on. Did some physics simulation actually to shrink wrap or to basically do like a negative pressure cloth simulation to wrap this character. And then I took in ArmorPaint and I painted with it, right? So it's not much different than what, if you're familiar with Substance, than working with Substance. You can bring in textures, and then when you take textures and you apply them together to through a node-based system. Again, this node-based system is building off of what Blender already has. So if you work in Blender, the materials in here are pretty much compatible. And so you plug your textures in here, and then you can paint with these materials. Now, a couple of things that I have been struggling with workflow wise is that this is me painting on the low poly in some ways, and so this does not the workflow right now doesn't allow you to sort of paint on the high poly and then bake to the low poly inside of the tool. They have some baking, but it bakes just to the high poly or just a primary model that you're texturing on. And so to get that baked down for games onto a low poly model, you have to put in a little bit of effort to take it back out into something like Blender. And then, like I said, Blender does have some baking functionality, but it doesn't bake all the different maps you really want for games. So that's where Text Tools comes in. That Text Tools baking has a broad range of different types of bakes you can create. And what I'm working on right now is figuring out a workflow to get it out of or get it baked down in a way that I can copy all the maps across easily to my low poly. But even like some of the more what were sort of the cutting edge things in Substance maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, this tool is adding in. So even like painting with particle brushes, painting with sort of projection map painting onto the surface. The serviceable stuff is there, and I guess that's a big point to take away with a lot of these open source tools in the workflow, is that define what is necessary, and what is just sort of like that's nice to have. If what you're trying to do falls underneath that, hey, this is necessary and these tools will work for you, then great. But if you're pushing the bounds of certain things, like again, if I'm really heavy into photogrammetry in my workflow, I might not lean on Meshroom just because the amount of or the delta between how long it will take Meshroom to process the same photos and say Metashape, I might lean more towards Metashape for that because it's just going to make sense in that production. The other tool, like I said, it looks very similar. It's in alpha, I think, still, is this processing tool. I don't know if I go to their cloud setup, and you can also associate other cloud links to this. Let me just find a. Let's see. Let's go to the. Find a texture real quick to show you the processing of this stuff. Okay, I'm just going to throw this one over here. So what this is a tool to generate a bunch of maps based on an image. Okay, so it looks very similar because they're just sort of building these things off of the same core libraries. Maybe this tool will end up being incorporated directly into ArmorPaint, but the idea here is this would replace Adobe Substance Sampler, right? And so you plug in the texture. You can also put in some nodes to control stuff, but you just run it, and it's going to generate, of course, your base color, your occlusion, your roughness, your metallic, so on and so forth. So you can use this to generate tileable maps that create all of the textures that are associated with a full PBR material stack. So again, I think it's solid. We've been using it at the governor's school this semester because we don't have access to Substance this semester. And I will say the machines are being updated there, and they're running 1080s there, and we are having occasional crashes on 1080s. So again, stability-wise, how many people are using the software dictates how much feedback the developers are usually getting with open source in terms of, hey, this thing's breaking on my particular hardware configuration. They don't have teams of people like, hopefully, paid software does, testing stuff on the regular on a bunch of different configurations. So rigging, Blender has rigging. It's another area that is serviceable. In a lot of ways, they're supposed to be doing a revamp. Blender has switched over to a 1-year cycle through major updates. So we're on 3.4 right now, I believe. And so by version 4.0, I wouldn't be surprised if the new, more user-friendly rigging system is in there. So the rigging system that's in there now is not bad. It's just it's not as it's just usability wise, it's a little clunky. Traditional animation, completely doable in Blender, very easy to do. The biggest things I would say are there isn't a built-in layer blending system in Blender, so you have to kind of you can use an NLA editor or nonlinear animation editor to do some stuff, but it's a little bit clunky and it doesn't quite work as fluidly as like say Maya layers do to blend animations together. You can, still motion capture stuff. So obviously, motion capture is super expensive. I will say there is a professional software called Move. If you want to look it up, it's Move.ai. That's looking very promising. The pricing model is not clear as of yet, but it does really good stuff with just a couple GoPros or a couple iPhones or what, some traditional, basic streaming cameras. If you do want to go open source, one of the better ones I've found is Free Mocap. And so if you check out Free Mocap, the biggest thing that I will say is that, again, it's not as tested in different circumstances. So you're not going to do a recording of 18 people in a warehouse. I mean, that would be a nightmare anyway, in any way you cut it. But doing it with Free Mocap, you're probably looking at one individual. It does, however, track some basic hand and face movement. So you can get some of that while you're tracking the entire body, and it does a fairly good job. It is an AI-based setup, so it's the AI has been trained, and it's in development. But this one is probably the most, out of everything I'm showing you guys today, the most sort of academic research version of an open source alternative. Special effects wise, Blender does all the different types of special effects that Maya and Houdini can do. Does it do it as well? No, I mean it does decently, but the big thing with Houdini especially is that if you throw a Threadripper at it, say a fluid simulation, it's going to really use all that and you'll get the benefits of that hardware. Blender again sort of tends to, in my experience, kind of cap out. Now that being said, or just recently I worked on with some students on the 48-hour film festival project, and let's see if I can get to the part where we did some basic simulation here. Vimeo is not the best with scrubbing on stuff. Oh, we basically simulated a nuclear explosion using Blender fluids. Blender uses MantaFlow now for its fluids. There is a add-on if you do want to get the really high-end sort of fluid simulations for smoke, particles, other things like that. There is one called, and I'm going to forget the name. It'll come back to me, but Flip Fluids. Flip Fluids will add on, but again, I think it's like $100 charge for that, right? So if you're using the MantaFlow stuff, it does work well. It's not as advanced as say some of the Houdini stuff, and doesn't quite do the same thing as like the Flip Fluids even. But it's serviceable, right? Depends on what you're trying to do with it. Most of the time for games, we're trying to create a simulation to render it out as a sequence of images and put it in like a real-time particle effect in Unity or something like that. Audio-wise, don't ask me. I'm not an audio person. I can say that Ardour is one that comes up a lot, and then of course you have the one that just got purchased and it was really questionable. Sorry, my brain's running out of juice already. But there are some options out there, but they're from what I can gather, the offering is a little less robust on the audio side. All right, so when we talk about coding, right? You have Unreal, Unity on the prosumer side. Godot is an option out there. Godot's been around for a while. It seems like it's pretty solid. They just got some interesting investment that allow them to sort of have some pro offerings as part of a way of funding development and whatnot. Still will be free for the engine and whatnot, but another one, like I said, Armory is built by the same guys that do ArmorPaint, and it's leveraging a lot of the real-time rendering stuff and the setup inside of Blender, again, my biggest concern with ArmorPaint, Armor Lab, and Armory is that it's a small team that are being very ambitious and they're spread really far apart, so the updates don't come as often as I would like in any one of those things. Me personally, I am a Unity developer. I've dabbled a little bit in Godot. I would say, depending on what you're trying to create, Godot is perfectly fine. But again, if we're going to put them in a hierarchy, Godot would be slightly under Unity, and then Unity would be slightly under Unreal in terms of like that AAA development process. IDEs are all over the place, but why bother? Visual Studio is amazing, and you can get Visual Studio Code now, and it was an open source project. So even though it's curated still by Microsoft, it is technically open source. So this is some of the stuff that I'm working on right now. So this is a little look dev scene I'm working on for sort of some space station horror game concepts I'm working on. All this, most of it was sort of generated with open source software. The texture maps were done with ArmorPaint, so on and so forth. So, this is just sort of a work in progress. It's a bit of a proof of concept. And so, yeah, that's the wild ride there. Lots of stuff, lots of things to consider. Here's, my most current project, my little boy. And so, yeah, I'll leave his cute face up there and leave it open for any questions if we have time for that.
Excellent. How much is that cute boy enjoying working in FMOD and WIs? Any thoughts on those?
Yeah, no, he's working in Pampers, and that's where most of his pivotal work gets done. So, but no, it's been a fun journey becoming a dad, but it's also been a unique set of challenges balancing it with everything else. So, very cool stuff. Licenses, in terms of the software licenses for open source, like MIT and stuff like that. I don't remember each software is different license, but I think let me see. So most of them, I think, do fall under the type of licenses that they will be open source forever. Like you cannot take and make derivatives. I know for a long time Blender had issues with. Blender is GNU, or General Public Use, or General Public License, and so Blender did have some issues with people trying to repackage Blender and sell it and whatnot. But here's a interesting wrinkle to it. There are also other libraries that a lot of these softwares use. So obviously Python is part of Blender, so it uses the license with Python. Bullet physics is the sort of rigid body physics system that Blender uses, and that's the zlib license. The libmv library uses the MIT license, and so on and so forth. So I from everything I kind of remember about some of the core ones I identified here, they fall under some sort of licenses or open source licenses where you never have to worry about them going closed source. I know with Audacity, that was the audio program that I was trying to think of earlier. With Audacity, that was kind of some of the weird concerns when it was actually the company was purchased, and they sort of changed up the models a little bit. But from everything I can tell from Blender, from Krita, from ArmorPaint, they all sort of fall under those sort of GNU GPL licenses that should make them free forever. Does that kind of address the question?
Yeah. Have you ever had to deal with any institution, especially educational, that it didn't like you using open source and want to use specific software they already provided?
Actually, no. I've had the opposite happen a lot more, where people, if they're unfamiliar with the open source, maybe it takes a conversation. But like IT has been very happy with open source. It's sort of easy to set up and maintain. I did didn't bring this up earlier, but like one of the reasons I like the Windows side of things too is I can manage a lot of my updates through the Windows Store. I think everything besides GIMP out of my primary tools is in the Windows Store, and of course on your Linux distributions, there are ways to keep things updated automatically. So yeah, overall, I've had less pushback from on an educational standpoint getting these open source softwares approved and installed and maintained than the closed source softwares. The closed source, especially like Unity's, I've been a fan of Unity for a long time, but some of their licensing tends to throw IT for a little bit of a loop sometimes, depending on where they're at in their development cycle.
All right, sounds great. We're going to move Zach into chat. Bring your questions for him there. And next up, we're going to start talking about the indie dev process. Thank you again, Zach.
Thank you.